The words left my mouth before I understood what they would cost me, and by the time I saw her face change, it was already too late to take them back because sometimes the truth doesn't arrive as a confession. It arrives disguised as a joke. And once it's spoken aloud, there is no version of the world where you can pretend you didn't mean it. We were sitting on the same worn-out bench we had claimed as ours 11 years ago, the one behind the old library with the cracked paint, and the initials some other couple had carved into the wood decades before we ever sat there. The evening was doing that thing it does in late autumn, where the light turns gold and forgiving, like it's trying to make peace with the day before it disappears. Amara was laughing at something I'd said, her head tilted back, her hand resting on my forearm the way it always did when something struck her as genuinely funny and not just polite. And in that ordinary, unremarkable moment, I really looked at her, and the joke slipped out of me, like a confession wearing a disguise. I told her she may as well just marry me already, since she was practically my wife anyway, cooking for me when I was sick, arguing with landlords on my behalf, remembering my mother's medication schedule better than I did. I said it, the way you say things you've rehearsed so many times in your head that they finally forget to stay silent. She didn't laugh. She didn't roll her eyes and call me an idiot the way she usually did when I said something absurd. Instead, she went quiet for 3 long seconds, 3 seconds, that somehow contained 11 years of history, and then she turned to me with an expression I had never seen on her before, something between amusement and terror and hope, all at once. And she asked me, so softly I almost missed it beneath the sound of the wind moving through the trees. What exactly was stopping us? I want you to sit with that question the way I had to sit with it, because I promise you, by the end of this story, you will understand why it nearly broke me, and why answering it honestly meant confronting every excuse I had built my life around for over a decade. If you believe people deserve second chances, if you believe that kindness has the power to rebuild what fear tears down, take a moment right now to like this video. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. Share it with someone who needs a reminder that it's never too late, and subscribe to the channel, because stories like this one are exactly why we're here. Now, let's go back to where it all began, because you can't understand the weight of her question without understanding the years that built up to it. I met Amara when I was 23 years old, and convinced I had already ruined my life. I had dropped out of an engineering program 2 semesters before graduation, not because I failed academically, but because my father had suffered a stroke that left the right side of his body weakened, and someone needed to run the small hardware shop he had spent 30 years building from nothing. My mother couldn't manage the shop and his recovery at the same time, and my 2 older siblings had already moved to different cities with families and mortgages and excuses that were reasonable, but still excuses. So I stayed. I learned to price plumbing fittings and argue with wholesale suppliers and smile at customers who complained about prices I didn't set. I told myself it was temporary. 3 years later, it still wasn't. Amara worked at the small print shop 2 doors down, the one that made business cards and wedding invitations and the occasional funeral pamphlet, and she used to walk past our shop every morning, carrying a thermos of tea that smelled like cardamom and something sweeter I could never identify. For the first few months, we exchanged nothing more than nods. Then one rainy afternoon, her shop's ceiling started leaking directly onto a batch of finished wedding invitations for a client picking them up in an hour, and she burst into my shop soaked and panicked, asking if we had anything that could stop water from ruining 800 rupees worth of cardstock. I found her a roll of plastic sheeting and helped her rig something resembling a tent over the boxes, both of us on our knees on her shop floor, laughing at the absurdity of 2 adults constructing a makeshift shelter out of packaging material. She saved the invitations. She also, without either of us realizing it, saved something in me that had been quietly dying under the weight of obligation and disappointment. We became inseparable in the way that only happens when 2 people recognize loneliness in each other without ever naming it aloud. She had moved to the city alone after her mother passed away, estranged from a father who had remarried within a year of the funeral, and she carried that particular kind of grief that doesn't announce itself with tears, but instead shows up as an intense, almost frightening independence, the kind that refuses help because help once disappeared exactly when it was needed most. I understood that instinct because I lived inside my own version of it. We started having lunch together most days, sharing the cheap tiffin meals her landlady prepared, splitting the cost of chai from the stall on the corner, talking about everything except the things that actually mattered. Over the years, our lives braided together so completely that neither of us could say where the friendship ended and something else began, if something else had begun at all. She was there the night my father had his second stroke, sitting with my mother in the hospital corridor at 2 inches the morning, holding a cup of vending machine coffee she never drank. Just so I wouldn't be alone with my fear. I was there the year her shop nearly went under, staying up until midnight helping her rebuild an inventory system on a borrowed laptop, both of us surviving on instant noodles and stubbornness. We celebrated each other's small victories, a new client, a healthy checkup, a rare good month of sales with the same intensity most people reserve for weddings and births, because we had learned, both of us, that the ordinary triumphs of survival deserved celebration too. And yet, for 11 years, neither of us ever said the word that would have changed everything. I want to be honest with you about why, because this is the part of the story where I have to stop being the narrator and start being the man who made mistakes. The kind of mistakes that don't look like mistakes until you're standing on the other side of them, staring back at everything you could have said and didn't. I was engaged once, before Amara ever entered my life, to a woman named Reshma, someone my parents had chosen with good intentions and reasonable logic. She came from a respected family. She was educated. She was kind in the distant, dutiful way that people are kind when they've been taught that emotion is something to be managed rather than felt. We were engaged for 8 months before she called it off, not cruelly, but honestly, telling me that she had realized somewhere along the way that we were building a life together out of obligation rather than desire, and that she deserved more than a partner who was simply present, and I deserved more than a partner who was simply agreeable. She wasn't wrong. But the ending of that engagement did something to me that I didn't fully understand until years later. It convinced me that love, real love, the kind people write songs about, wasn't something that happened to people like me. I decided, somewhere in the wreckage of that broken engagement, that I would rather have something safe and steady than risk reaching for something that might collapse the way my first attempt had. And when Amara walked into my life 18 months later, soaked from the rain and laughing despite her panic, I made an unconscious decision that I have spent years trying to justify. I would let her be the safest, steadiest, most important person in my life. And I would never once call it what it actually was, because if I never named it, it could never be taken from me the way Reshma had been taken. That is the quiet tragedy at the center of this story. Not that I didn't love Amara, but that I loved her so much, I was terrified to say so, because saying so meant admitting there was something left to lose. Amara, for her part, carried her own version of that same fear. She told me once, years into our friendship, about a boy she had loved in her hometown before her mother's death, someone she had planned an entire imagined future around, only to watch him marry someone else within a year of her moving away, as though her absence had erased her from his consideration entirely. She told me this story lightly, almost like a joke at her own expense. But I noticed the way her hands stilled when she spoke about it, the way she looked at the table instead of at me. I understood, without her having to explain it further, that she had also decided somewhere along the way that being needed was safer than being chosen. Because being needed couldn't be taken away on a whim, the way being chosen apparently could. So we built an entire life around each other without ever building the one thing that would have made that life complete. Both of us mistaking safety for contentment. Both of us calling our fear practicality whenever the question threatened to surface. I dated occasionally over the years a woman from the neighboring town for 8 months, a cousin's friend for almost a year, and each time Amara would smile and offer advice and pretend enthusiasm. And each time, the relationship would end for reasons that, looking back now, were always some version of the same reason. The other woman would eventually ask why I spent so much time with a friend I clearly cared about more than I cared about her, and I would have no honest answer, because the honest answer would have required admitting something I wasn't ready to admit even to myself. Amara dated too, though less often, and I remember the particular ache I felt the one time she mentioned a man seriously enough that I understood marriage might actually be discussed between them. An ache I labeled as protectiveness, because calling it jealousy would have required a reckoning I wasn't prepared to have. That relationship of hers ended within 4 months, and I never asked why, because some small, cowardly part of me was afraid the answer might involve me. and I didn't yet have the courage to hear it. Life moved forward the way it does, indifferent to our unspoken fears. My father passed away when I was 31, quietly, in his sleep, 5 years after his second stroke had left him increasingly frail. Amara was the one who sat with my mother during the cremation rites, translating grief into logistics, handling phone calls I couldn't bring myself to make, standing beside me at the pyre in a way that felt less like friendship and more like partnership, though I still didn't have the language for that word. My mother, in the strange clarity that grief sometimes grants people, pulled me aside during the mourning period and told me something I have never forgotten. She said that she had watched me build my entire adult life around a woman I refused to claim, and that she hoped I wasn't planning to wait until she, too, was gone before I found the courage to say what everyone except me seemed to already know. I told her she was imagining things. I told myself the same lie for another 3 years. Those 3 years were not without their own quiet erosions. Amara's shop finally succeeded, expanding into a small but respected printing business with 2 employees and a growing client list. And I watched her transform from a woman surviving alone into a woman who had built something real, something she could be proud of, and my pride in her was so enormous it frightened me, because pride that large usually has a name, and the name I refused to give it was love. My hardware shop, meanwhile, slowly modernized under my management, and I finally allowed myself small ambitions expanding into electrical supplies, hiring an assistant, so I wasn't chained to the counter every waking hour, taking the occasional Sunday off, something I hadn't done in years. My mother's health remained stable, and for the first time since my father's stroke, I had space in my life that wasn't consumed entirely by obligation. And in that space, the question I had been avoiding for over a decade began to grow louder, the way silence often does when you finally stop filling it with noise. The turning point, the true beginning of the end of my cowardice, came on an ordinary Tuesday that I have replayed in my mind more times than I can count. Amara had been unusually quiet for almost 2 weeks, and when I finally pressed her about it over our usual lunch, she told me, in the careful, measured voice she used when delivering news she had rehearsed, that her aunt in Pune had been urging her to consider a marriage proposal from a widower with 2 young children, a respectable, financially stable man in his late 30s who was, by every practical measure, a reasonable match. She said her aunt had been persistent, framing it as Amara's last realistic opportunity to build the family life she had quietly wanted for years, but never openly discussed. She said all of this while stirring her tea slowly, not looking at me, and I understood, with a kind of sick clarity, that she was not asking for my opinion out of casual curiosity. She was giving me an opportunity to say something, anything, that might change the direction of her life, and she was giving me that opportunity because some part of her still hoped I would take it. I did not take it, I told her, with a calmness that horrifies me even now to remember, that if the man seemed kind and stable, she shouldn't dismiss the proposal just because it wasn't the fairy tale she might have once imagined for herself. I told her that practicality mattered, that children needed mothers, that stability was its own form of love. Every word I said was a betrayal disguised as wisdom, and the worst part is that I knew it even as I said it, and I said it anyway, because agreeing to her aunt's proposal felt safer than admitting that the thought of her marrying another man made something in my chest collapse in on itself, like a building giving way. She nodded slowly at everything I said, thanked me for my honesty, and changed the subject to something inconsequential about a client who wanted metallic gold ink for wedding cards. We finished our lunch as we always did, and I walked back to my shop feeling like I had just handed away something irreplaceable and called it generosity. For the following 6 weeks, Amara grew distant in small, deliberate ways that I recognized only in hindsight. She began arriving later to our usual lunches, sometimes canceling entirely with vague excuses about client meetings. She stopped mentioning her aunt's proposal altogether, which I mistakenly interpreted as her having quietly let the matter drop, when in reality, as I would later learn, she had begun seriously corresponding with the widower, exchanging photographs, arranging a formal meeting between their families. I noticed her pulling away, and instead of asking her why, instead of confronting the fear that had governed my entire adult life, I told myself that people naturally drift as their circumstances change, that her growing business simply demanded more of her time, that I had no right to expect her constant presence, just because I had grown accustomed to it. I chose comfortable ignorance over uncomfortable truth, the same choice I had been making for 11 years, except this time, the cost of that choice was about to become unbearable. My mother noticed the change before I fully allowed myself to. She asked me one evening, over dinner, why Amara hadn't visited in nearly a month, and when I gave her some hollow explanation about business commitments, she set down her fork and looked at me with the particular exhaustion of a parent who has watched her child make the same mistake too many times to stay silent about it any longer. She told me plainly that Amara was not going to wait forever for a man too afraid to claim what was already his, and that if I lost her to someone else because of my own cowardice, I would spend the rest of my life understanding exactly what heartbreak felt like, except it would be a heartbreak entirely of my own making. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake replaying 11 years of small moments I had spent so long dismissing as ordinary friendship, the way she always remembered how I took my tea without needing to ask, the way she had rearranged an entire month of her work schedule to sit with my mother during my father's final illness, the way her face lit up in a particular, unguarded way whenever I walked into a room, a way I now understood I had seen 100 times and refused to name. I thought about the widower in Pune, a man I had never met, who might soon hold the privilege of coming home to her every evening, of building the family she had quietly wanted, of being trusted with the version of herself she had spent years protecting from anyone, who might disappear the way her mother and her father and her first love had all disappeared. And I understood, with a clarity that felt almost violent in its suddenness, that I had spent over a decade mistaking fear for restraint, and that if I did not act now, I would lose the one person who had never once, in 11 years, given me a real reason to be afraid. I went to her shop the very next morning before it opened, standing outside in the early light like a man waiting to confess to a crime, and when she arrived and saw me there, her expression shifted through surprise, then wariness, then something guarded that broke my heart, because I understood I had put it there myself. I asked her, without any of my usual jokes to hide behind, whether the meeting with the widower's family had happened, and she told me quietly that it had, and that both families seemed pleased, and that a decision would likely be made within the month. She said this evenly, professionally, the way she might describe a business arrangement, rather than the direction of the rest of her life, and I understood that she was protecting herself from me. Finally, after 11 years of leaving herself unprotected, I asked her to walk with me, just once more, to our bench behind the library, and something in my voice must have carried enough desperation to break through her careful distance, because she agreed. We sat there in silence for a long time before I found the courage to speak, and when I finally did, I told her everything I had been too afraid to say for over a decade. I told her about Reshma, about the fear that love was something that inevitably collapsed, about how I had decided, without ever consciously admitting it, that keeping her as a friend felt safer than risking her as a partner, because friends who remain friends don't leave the way fiancés do. I told her that I had watched her build a life, a business, a version of herself that made me prouder than anything I had ever accomplished myself, and that somewhere in that pride, I had buried a love I was too much of a coward to name. I told her that the thought of her marrying another man, of another man learning the particular rhythm of her laughter, of another man being trusted with her fear of abandonment, felt like watching my own life being carried away by someone else's hands. I told her I was sorry, sincerely and completely, for every year I had spent treating her devotion as something owed to friendship, rather than something offered out of love. She listened to all of it without interrupting, her eyes wet but her expression unreadable in the particular way of someone who has trained herself for years not to hope too visibly. And when I finally finished, exhausted by the weight of everything I had been carrying, I made the joke, the same joke I had made 100 times before over the years. The reflexive deflection I always used whenever emotion threatened to become too heavy to hold. I told her that after everything, she might as well just marry me already, since she was practically my wife anyway. And this time she didn't laugh it off the way she always had. This time, she looked at me with 11 years of restrained hope finally rising to the surface. And she asked me, so quietly the wind almost carried the words away before I could catch them, what exactly was stopping us. I sat there for a moment that felt endless, understanding that this was the exact fork in the road I had been avoiding my entire adult life, understanding that I could still retreat into another joke, another deflection, Another decade of safe, comfortable cowardice. Or I could finally, for the first time, tell her the truth without hiding behind humor. I told her that nothing was stopping us, nothing except my own fear, a fear I no longer wanted to carry, a fear I was finally ready to set down if she was willing to help me carry something better in its place. She started crying then, the kind of crying that comes not from sadness, but from the sudden release of something held too tightly for too long. And she told me that she had spent 11 years waiting for me to say something, anything, that would give her permission to want the thing she had wanted, since the day I helped her rescue those wedding invitations from the rain. She told me she had agreed to meet the widower's family not because she wanted that life, but because she had finally convinced herself that the life she actually wanted would never be offered to her, and that a stable, practical arrangement felt better than spending the rest of her years hoping for something that was never going to arrive. She told me that when I encouraged her, weeks earlier, to consider the proposal seriously, some part of her heart had quietly broken, because she had been giving me every opportunity to stop her, and I hadn't taken a single one. I asked her, right there on that bench, whether she would allow me to be late, painfully, embarrassingly late, but sincere, and whether she would consider building the life we had already unknowingly built together for 11 years, except this time with honesty instead of avoidance at its foundation. She said yes before I even finished the question, the same way she had said yes to helping a stranger with leaking invitations all those years ago. Without hesitation, because that was who she had always been, someone who gave fully once she trusted that the giving would be received. The following weeks were not without their complications, because life rarely allows love to arrive without cost. Amara's aunt was furious, having already begun informal negotiations with the widower's family, and it took several difficult, uncomfortable conversations to withdraw gracefully. Conversations Amara handled with a dignity I deeply admired, refusing to let anger or embarrassment diminish the respect she showed to a family that, through no fault of their own, had briefly hoped for a match that was never going to happen. My mother, when I told her, wept openly, not from sorrow but from a relief so profound. It seemed to physically lighten her, and she told me that she had been waiting 11 years to say what she said next, which was simply that she had always considered Amara her daughter in every way that mattered, and that formalizing it would only make official what her heart had already decided long ago. We were married the following spring, in a small ceremony that neither of us wanted to be elaborate, because we had both learned, through years of quiet struggle, that the ordinary, unglamorous moments of a life shared honestly are worth infinitely more than any performance of celebration. My mother sat in the front row, healthier and happier than I had seen her in years. Amara's few remaining relatives from her hometown attended, along with the small community of clients and neighbors who had watched both of our businesses grow over the years. People who told us afterward that they had always assumed we were already married, given how naturally we moved through the world together. If this story has touched something in you, if it reminded you of your own quiet fears, your own delayed courage, your own version of a bench behind a library where an unspoken truth finally found its voice, please take a moment to like this video and share it with someone who needs permission to stop waiting. Comment below and tell me about a moment in your own life when fear almost cost you something precious, and what finally gave you the courage to speak. Your stories matter more than you know, and this channel exists because of the honesty you bring to this community every single day. Before I close this story, I want to ask you for something small but meaningful. If the word hope resonates with everything you've just witnessed, the hope that carried Amara through 11 years of quiet waiting, the hope that finally gave me the courage to stop hiding behind jokes and deflections, the hope that reminds all of us that it is never too late to tell the truth to the people we love, type hope in the comments below. I read every single one, and I want to know how many of you are carrying your own quiet hope tonight, waiting for the courage to speak it aloud. Amara and I have been married for 3 years now, and there are still evenings when we sit on that same bench behind the library, the paint even more cracked than it was the day we first claimed it, and we talk about how strange it is that we built an entire life together before either of us had the courage to admit we wanted it. She tells me sometimes, laughing in that particular way that still undoes me after all these years, that she is grateful the wedding invitation shop ceiling leaked on that rainy afternoon so long ago, because without that small, ordinary disaster, we might never have found each other at all. I tell her that some things are simply meant to happen, even when we spend years too afraid to let them. We adopted a daughter last year, a bright, fierce 3-year-old named Anya, from a shelter Amara had been volunteering at since before we were married, and watching Amara become a mother has been its own kind of quiet miracle. The final piece of a life we almost let fear take away from us entirely. My mother, now Anya's doting grandmother, tells anyone who will listen that she always knew. From the very first year Amara walked into our lives soaked from the rain, that she was watching her future daughter-in-law, long before either of us understood it ourselves. I think about that Tuesday often, the one where I nearly told her to accept another man's proposal, and I understand now how close I came to losing everything I hadn't yet allowed myself to claim. I think about how many of us are living our own version of that Tuesday right now, watching something precious slip quietly away, because naming our love feels riskier than losing it in silence. If there is one thing I hope you carry away from this story, it is this: the people who have already shown you, through years of quiet devotion, exactly how deeply they care, deserve to hear you say it aloud before circumstance makes the decision for you. Don't wait for someone else to ask what's stopping you. Ask yourself, honestly, tonight, and then have the courage to answer.